All right, we are back for our latest episode of Boardroom RevOps, where we're bringing you valuable tips from RevOps experts so you can make it to the C-suite. I'm James, co-founder of Accounting, the RevOps BI platform. Super excited to welcome Bennet Simonton to the show today. He's a RevOps leader at Mirakl. Bennet, good to see you again.
Awesome to be here, James. This is my second podcast now, and I learned a lot from the first one. So hopefully I talk a little less this time and learn from my
No,
mistakes.
I hope you talk a lot. We're going to dive into a fun topic today that we haven't covered on the podcast too much, and that's enablement and kind of the role that RevOps plays in it. I know it's something that you're fairly passionate about. We'll dive in here shortly, but why don't you share your kind of quick background for folks to level set?
Yeah, so I'm a sales guy at heart. I think that like a lot of people in RevOps, you start in some sort of go-to-market function and you end up finding your way to the revenue operations sphere somehow. And I sort of took the traditional path from BDR to SMB account executive, mid-market enterprise, and through that process, sort of saw the good, the bad, and the ugly when it comes to RevOps and their relationship with sales. I felt like on the RevOps side, really analytical, highly technical, but sometimes because of they weren't necessarily part of a go-to-market function at some point, or hadn't been in a while. They had maybe lost touch a little bit with the woes that the individual seller is kind of going through on the ground level, like what you hate about Salesforce and all the other go-to-market tools. And I felt if I could pair this understanding of the sales process, the tools that are being used, with a more of a technical understanding of behind the scenes of these tools, um, I could have a positive impact on our revenue operations org. So I got Salesforce certified during COVID and made the jump into revenue operations. Sort of felt like, hey, I was never that smooth of a talker. I wasn't the best account executive when it came to like, holding meetings and crushing it in that regard, but I was always able to hold my own by just manipulating the tools that we had in a more efficient way than other people. And I felt like I could pass that down. And so that's really at the heart of my sort of RevOps journey is just helping account executives and BDRs hit quotas more easily.
That's great. I think it's so easy for RevOps and sales to get like a little adversarial, but I think when you come from that background, it lessens that a little bit. There's a little bit more empathy for sure.
Yeah, I try. I think that I'm always trying to tie back, how what we do on the RevOps side of things is to help make it easier for them. And when it's not, I try to really prioritize and ask myself, am what I'm doing as a RevOps professional benefiting the company? It's one thing to report on pipeline and analytics, but if you're not driving pipeline, what is that reporting doing for you? So of course there's this admin and this sort of keep the lights on functionality of RevOps where you're making sure these tools are working and you're reporting and you're giving board reports and making sure that all that data is highly accurate, of course. But reporting on pipeline itself doesn't generate more pipeline for you. So I always sort of keep that as sort of my North Star of, how do I have an impact?
Totally, and I think that's great. And as an analytics company, we often talk to our customers about that too. It's like, you can spin up all the dashboards you want, but basically everything you look at should have a corresponding action, right? Based on what the data is saying. So that's near and dear to me. Let's dive in. So enablement, something that I think you're fairly passionate about. Start with the basics. Like, what does enablement mean to you? I think in some companies it's slightly different than other places.
Totally. And I think that, depending on the size of your team, you're going to have more robust of an enablement program built out. I think that if you are at a smaller company, enablement and everything under that umbrella could roll up into revenue operations. And in the past, where I was in a small revenue operations team in a smaller org, that was the case. Whereas at a larger company where I'm at like right now, it's definitely separated into different umbrellas where you have sort of your classic enablement, which I almost see as like sales training in a way of your med pick and how do you lead conversations and inbound and outbound cold calling and writing emails, those sort of almost sales training aspects of enablement, uh, slide shows for what you're going to present to clients, right? That sort of thing. Whereas on the RevOps side, that can usually mean more around training on the sales tools. And I think this is a very highly overlooked piece of revenue operations. And what I sort of see as RevOps enablement is how do we take this core tech stack that we have and make sure that BDRs specifically, but anybody in the outbound motion is utilizing these tools to the best of their ability. And I think that there's a disconnect sometimes between leadership, sometimes realizing how much understanding how to use these tools dictates your strategy with your outbound campaigns, right? So if you have a true understanding of how to leverage an outreach or a sales loft in a way that allows you to get a lot of touch points out there, but maintain a super personalized and what seems to be highly manual process, it opens up a whole new range of strategy that you as a BDR or sales leader can implement. So my role is to help enable sales leaders by helping to understand those tools and BDRs themselves. And so whether it's leadership driving the outbound strategies or a more BDR individual led org where they're sort of in control of their own destiny more, making sure that whoever's in control of that has complete access and understanding of those tools so they can execute on those campaigns.
That's great. I think like there's a couple of themes in there I really like. One, tying the enablement and the tools for that matter to strategy, and then two, kind of in line with the comment around generating more pipeline with pipeline reports is like impacting the bottom line. And so I see how like tying together tools and strategy actually it can lead to more pipeline, like greater close rate. So just talk to me a little bit like how do you reconcile those three things or kind of communicate them with folks? And I guess maybe I'm trying to get to like phasing as well. Like how do we tie these things together?
Yeah, so I think that the first thing that I like to get an understanding of is, what is our strategies? What is our breakdown of our campaigns? And usually that's tied down to, industry and vertical for the most part. So for example, if when I was working at my previous company, we were e-commerce focused on fashion companies. We had it broken down by footwear and swimwear and all the other different categories. Whereas my current company, we are e-commerce in general, and we're breaking it down by construction equipment and electronics. And so the idea is how can we break down this outbound approach into smaller verticals that we can have these sequences have messaging that is specific to those verticals. And once you learn about the strategies of outreach and the functionality that you have access to, you can then equip those sequences to look highly personalized based on those verticals. And so that's where I start first is understanding, okay, what is our strategy? How do we break these account lists down? Are we actually doing that in outreach where we have sequences for all these breakdowns and how granular can we go?
Hmm.
Like it doesn't make sense to have 10 different strategies going on at once. Can we get to a place where we have 15, right? Really breaking it down, really granular. For example, with EMEA, when I was working with EMEA in the past, we would do it by country and by vertical. And that way, when we're dropping names in outreach sequences, we're really creating that FOMO. We work with swimwear brands in the UK, such as XYZ. And then, in other emails following it, I wanted to reference, I mentioned in my previous email, our work with Tier, right? Here's a case study from them. And so even those are
Hmm.
automated emails, it starts to feel when you're layering that specific, customization based on those verticals, starts to feel very personalized and manual. So that's step one. Step two is, do we have a way of easily isolating those contacts in Salesforce to match those campaigns that we have
Hmm.
in outreach? And those things go hand in hand sometimes, right? Sometimes you'll realize, oh wait, we have this information in Salesforce and we've been able to unlock it through understanding contact list views in Salesforce. Okay, now that we can segment by this in as a list view in Salesforce, let's make an outreach campaign tied to that. So what I try to work with BDR leadership on and individuals is let's figure out how to break down our accounts and contacts as granular as possible in Salesforce, where we have a bunch of different contact list views in Salesforce. And those contact list views should all correlate to a specific outreach campaign. And then from there, we can pull those quickly and easily into those campaigns and outreach. So that's where we start, is getting those campaigns going. From there, it's all about how do we optimize those. So thinking about length of campaigns, sequence structure, where do we put manual versus automated emails? What's the time gap between those emails? How do we look at sprints versus elongated campaigns?
Hmm.
And so I dive really deeply into that and sort of show what our functionality is when it comes to that within outreach. Um, So for example, I know I've been talking a lot here, but for example, um, layering on short sprints with a longer campaign. So when you fully understand the functionality of a tool like Outreach, you understand, okay, I don't need to create three different sequences or keep on adding people back into sequences after they get through a sequence. I can create a long sequence that encompasses multiple quarters where I have
Mm.
a short sprint of, and we see data shows short sprints work. So I think, oh, let me create short little sequences. That's not necessarily the case. What you should be doing is creating short sprints within longer sequences. So we'll do a sprint of 3 emails in an email thread, 4 emails in an email thread over the course of, a week and a half, 2 weeks. Then you can take a break, right, for 3, 4 weeks, however you want. Then another short sprint, and sort of layer that on top of each other, making sure that the first email is always a manual email where you're using a manual subject line, manual email body, and then those follow-up emails are auto emails because the person's always referencing that first email. It looks highly manual. And also the subject line that's manual that you took a lot of time to create, you're getting a lot of juice out of it because the auto reply emails below are replies to that thread. So even though they're auto emails, they're referencing the manual subject line. Things
This
of
is great. Yeah, it's a great example and definitely something you've clearly thought a lot about. So just to recap, I think like as we think about bringing together strategy, tooling, enablement, the bottom line. In this example, you guys kind of started strategically like with our ICP analysis. Who do we want to target? How do we want to target them? Moved into kind of like data foundation. Do we have the enrichment data? Do we need it? Is it in a consumable manner? Enabled the team through it sounds like you kind of configuring outreach and tooling to work pretty well, and then like guiding the team to actually use these things properly. Is that kind of like a fair encapsulation?
Yeah, totally. And of course, the BDR team, leadership, enablement, they're really focused on like the composition of those emails. But what I
Yeah.
try to teach is just overall structure, functionality, tips and tricks, little things like how do we use variables in outreach to um, again come off highly personalized, right? So there's variables in outreach like weekdays from now n, where you can input the number of days from now to request a meeting, and trainings around, well, you actually don't want to send your calendar link because that can increase your chances of going into spam.
Mm.
But if you use this, it seems like you spent the time of finding the day that works for you. You're having a call to action in there. People don't click on calendar links anyways. So it's little tips and tricks like that that also contribute to the body of those emails. But yeah, to your point, it's structurally how do we structure those sequences, and strategically how do we execute on ideas that you as a team have, with the knowledge of what is possible in Salesforce.
Super interesting. I want to like take a step back a little bit and talk about just like RevOps and enablement generally. How do you think about enablement from like a topic perspective? So you mentioned depending on the company size, like there might be an existing enablement function that might skew more towards sales training. As you're thinking about enablement and RevOps, do you have like a calendar where you're like, hey, this month we're going to focus on this, next month we're going to focus on this? Is it more ad hoc, or like how do you think through like your topics on the enablement front?
Yeah, I think there's new hires and then there's ongoing trainings. And for me, again, going back to sort of my sales roots, I don't like to jump in as a RevOps, trainer and dive right into Salesforce. So I give everyone a few weeks to just get an understanding of the product and learn the sales methodologies. And then once they get a solid foundation, that's when we start to really dive into training within Salesforce and Outreach. And that, really work is around getting them to understand what's possible, right?
Mm.
Understanding, okay, any field on the contact object, any field on the account object, I can use to execute ideas. And that's really the key piece of it. I like to help them self-serve so they can execute on themselves. But I just want you to start to think about, okay, what is possible? And that way when we have new people in with new ideas, they can start to think of new ways of approaching things. So that's sort of step number one, is getting them to understand what's possible so they can come to me and be like, hey, like this is something I want to do. And then there's ongoing trainings. We do a weekly training with the team on all sorts of different topics, usually around Salesforce or outreach, but also contact enrichment databases like ZoomInfo, Cognism. just every tool that we have, and we're trying to do that on a reoccurring basis. And then I think also something that's missed oftentimes is leadership trainings on these tools too as well. That's something that I've done in the past, and it's been really successful. Again, it's all about letting them know it's possible. And so as soon as we did that training with the executive team, it was a million, hey, like, how do I run this? And that was great. Then those requests started to slow down, right? Because they started to learn, right, how to run those reports. And then it was more around the lines of, hey, like, I ran this report. Can you confirm, this is the
Mm.
right filters to apply? And then it just became like I'm in a meeting and they're showing reports everywhere. And I find that's also something that's really great, especially in a small company, right, where you have less resources, with the enabling leadership as well is super important.
Yeah, this is great. I think that's is probably going to be my biggest takeaway too, which it sounds so obvious in hindsight, which I think all great advice does. But the framing the enablement training is like, here's what's possible to get people kind of like invested and excited about it in terms of like doing their job and impacting their quota and earnings ultimately. Like, I guess I'm leading the witness here, but do you agree that that helps with like motivation and interest in the trainings? Like I hear so often or see so often that like enablement, sales reps would rather be selling so they don't join. Like, do you find you have pretty good like hit rate and attendance here because of how you frame this up?
Yeah, and I think that in general, it just raises the engagement like a lot, especially as we move into this complete automated, like, here's your tasks to do as a BDR team, right? Like, we've done it all for you. We figured out who your prospects are and your accounts, and we've come up with all the messaging, and we've automated all the sequences. And so your job is just to click call, and you call, and then you have a few manual emails where you write an email. And I think it takes away what I found to be like sort of the interesting part of being a BDR is getting out of the mundane and finding different
Being
strategies,
creative. Yeah.
new accounts, right? And I
Yeah.
think that if you take it away from people too much, you know, you lose that. And I think that there's a strong tendency to want to do that, especially with this like go-to-market roles that are coming out, and that makes a lot of sense in some ways. But I don't want people to lose that engagement at all.
Yeah. I think that's really, really smart. Get really deep in the weeds here on tactics, and maybe the answers are going to be incredibly obvious, but as you're doing these trainings, like how tactically are you accomplishing this? Is this a slide walkthrough? Are you getting in the tool and driving? Are you having them drive and coach them? Like, what do you think works best from like a delivery perspective?
Yeah. So starting off, I drive. So I show them what's possible, how to do things. Then, we get documents out to them going through everything that we just did. In those documents, it's a lot of videos, right? So I do a
Mm,
lot of video training recordings, broken down into 5-minute segments for each different subject. I think that that's more effective than saying, here's an hour-long training for you to listen to. So I have like a Salesforce list view training document, and for every section is a 5-minute video clip for them to watch, where they can kind of watch the video, then read the section, how Salesforce list views integrates with Outreach. Um, and so I think that that's key. And then also after that, sort of continuous ongoing training. So you'll reach out all the time and be like, hey, does everyone feel good about this? And they'll be like, yeah, I do. And then you have a training, and you're like, okay, let's pass it around the computer and let's try to target a list of all the accounts, all the contacts with these titles that haven't had touches in the last 6 months, that have confirmed mobile numbers, that have had a past opportunity with us, and they won't know how to execute on that. So it's all about just continuous training on from their perspective of actually going ahead and getting their hands dirty with it. And I do a lot of just one-on-one trainings as well. I think that, group trainings are great, but like you have to sit down one-on-one with somebody. And if some people just aren't in a position to do that. They have large BDR teams. They can't do those things. I'm lucky enough to, in the last couple of roles where I have a manageable size team where I have the ability to sit down and be like, okay, like it's 9 a.m. in the morning. Like take me through like what your process is. If you have nothing else to do today, how are you organizing yourself in a cold calling campaign?
yeah.
How are you setting yourself up for success when it comes to executing on emails?
Yeah, that's great. We're sadly coming up on time here. A couple final questions. You used the example around like the outbound training throughout this conversation, I think is great. Any other examples from your experience that of areas that you think are like really ripe for RevOps to lead enablement initiatives?
Yeah, I think that data hygiene, of course, is also a huge piece of this. I think that most teams will have access to some sort of contact enrichment tool. And I think that it's going more towards RevOps doing that for you in the back end. And I think that in an ideal world, for the most part, you'll have all the contacts there that you need with updated information. But I do think that there's value in every BDR, again, sort of back to that whole like control of your own destiny idea and engagement, has the ability to prospect and find new people and add people into their account list. And so LinkedIn Navigator training, how to segment and target through LinkedIn Navigator, and then alongside LinkedIn Navigator using contact databases like your ZoomInfos and Cognisms to, when you get a new account list, pull every single person that's relevant and then
Hmm.
mark those people is really important. Um, and so we really focused on getting everybody into the system and empowering you to do that. And then, how do you, if you have a large account, if you're trying to, prospect into, I don't know, Best Buy, right? Like, how do you take the 300 people we have in Salesforce and rank those and get ultimately down to, hey, like these are the three people I care about, and how do I, mark them in Salesforce and pull them up in lists, and so I can sit down and target those people. How do I have different tiers, right, of that where I can say, okay, like I want to target the top 50 people. I want to call through my top 50 people a day and kind of go down a sort of tiering almost of priority and enabling them to do that. So I do think a lot of it is, outbound enablement from a RevOps perspective.
Yeah, makes sense. That's great. Final question here. Where can enablement go wrong? Any pitfalls that RevOps folks might run into in executing?
Yes, I think it's a good question. I think that sometimes from like a training perspective, you can go wrong getting stuck in classic sales trainings, right? And I'm not saying that from teams that I've worked with, but people cold calling me, I'm like, what are they doing? Sometimes where I now 95% of the time I get a cold call, and that the answer, the response on the other side is, hey Bennett, just a heads up, this is a cold call. I hope that's okay. I'm like, dude. Like, or they'll just not mention why they're calling me or what their product does. And I'm all about, from a training perspective, really being crisp on, that side of things and making sure that when you call somebody, they answer the phone. You're not saying like, "Hey, is this Bennett?" Another pet peeve of mine, right? Like you're just already signaling to me that you're not even sure I am Bennet Simonton. Uh, so I like to teach from enablement side, like getting on the phone and really knowing each time you're calling somebody, like why you, why now? And then from a RevOps perspective, how do we make sure that that is getting into the tools that we're using properly? So for example, right now we're an enterprise company and we're trying to push volume, but we're calling C-suite enterprise professionals, director levels and above. And if you get someone on the line, you better treat them like a piece of gold and have a really targeted pitch. But we're also implementing things like power dialers into our sphere. And so how do you use a power dialer where you're calling 60 people in an hour, but also whenever that someone answers the phone,
You're ready to go.
they're ready. And there's some companies that are calling five people at once. And you can tell because I pick up the phone and then it's like, hey, is this Bennett? There's that pause, right? But how do you then say, hey, Bennett, this is Jim. I wanted to reach out to you. I know that you've recently made the jump from sales to revenue operations. Congratulations, by the way, on your new role at Mirakl. Because of your sales experience, I actually think that what we have to sell here at XYZ company would really hit home with you. We're helping companies in your space, such as Spotify or Shopify, increase their revenue by da 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 da. Right? Like that's what I want to hear on a cold call. And I think that RevOps, even though we're not training on that, we should be putting you in a position to do it. And I think that's also oftentimes a big miss from RevOps and from enablement in general is how do we increase automation, but like always maintain personalization.
Yeah, that's great. I think so topical right now too. Bennett, we're out of time. This is awesome. I should have plugged this at the beginning, but Bennett has an awesome YouTube channel called RevOps Bennett where he covers things like this in more and more detail. So you should definitely check that out. But thanks for joining me, man. This is really fun.
Thanks, James. Always a pleasure.